Good morning to all of you. It feels like coming home to be here. Listening to just the introductory words and thinking how long I spent working on the ground and how important that is for the work that I do now. It's really an honor to be here with all of you and to have a chance to speak with you, and it's very good that I'm sharing this opening session with my good friend and colleague, Don Steinberg. I also come with enthusiastic greetings from Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who would have loved to have been here, but send her regrets. I think you can see that she is managing a series of other things that are requiring her time right now. Now, the topic this morning is the role of government, the role of development in U.S. global engagement. And I think it's great that I will have a chance to give you my remarks if my voice allows it, because I have a bad cough. But it's also very good that we'll be able to hear from Don in a couple of moments, because really he's at the helm of what the United States is doing in the area of development as the #2 person at AID. And we've been invaluable partners in the work that we're doing together. But what I'd like to share with you is how Secretary Clinton and the State Department are thinking about global engagement in the 21st century. And to start, let me just quickly go back to something that Secretary Clinton said in 2009, right when she first started laying out her priorities for her work. In one of her major speeches, she said, "Our approach to foreign policy must reflect the world as it is, not as it used to be." And she set on to describe two inescapable facts that are parameters for our foreign policy and for development, and they are for you as well. The first one is that, of course, no nation can meet all the world's challenges alone. The issues are complex, and the threatening actors that are playing on the global arena are increasingly not states. They were during the Cold War years, but they are non-state players. Everything from criminal cartels to terrorist cells to rebel groups, and many of those are the ones that all of you are also encountering as you do your own work in the field. The second one is the nations around the world are concerned with the same global threats, and they're making wide-ranging and deep collaboration and cooperation is not just smart, but it's absolutely necessary. These are the two facts that now require, and the Secretary saw this from the beginning, a different global architecture for the way in which we operate and the way in which global engagement takes place in the 21st century. It's not long after that speech that Secretary Clinton mandated a review of the State Department and of AID's operations, policies, mandates. That is how the now famous or infamous QDDR, basically our efforts at a strategic plan, pointed in the direction of new approaches towards U.S. diplomacy and development. And as we face ever more tightening budgets, we also need to be efficient in doing it. We also need to work more closely and collaboratively with civil society organizations, non-government actors, including, of course, all our partners at Interaction. And as we face new threats and new opportunities, we need to be more nimble. And if our actions are going to match our ambitions, then we need to be more effective. So all of these things really came to discussion and study during the QDDR process. And several recommendations were made on shifts that needed to take place at the State Department and at AID. And the shifts really reflect the changing circumstances as Secretary Clinton saw them. Interestingly, those recommendations focused on how the United States can better lead through civilian power, which is really the title of the QDDR. Leveraging the great work of State Department, of AID, and of over 40 other domestic agencies and partner governments that are working throughout the world. Now, at the State Department, elevating our civilian power meant understanding how our diplomats and our policymakers are supporting governments so that these governments provide for and protect their citizens. In other words, are we helping governments protect their citizens, advance their civilian security, enhance the human dignity that their citizens merit? To do that, we need to build government institutions that provide for those individuals. This includes governments that respect the basic rights of their citizens. It includes civilian police forces that are rooted in the rule of law and whose mission is to protect citizens. It includes court and justice systems that are able to hold their citizens accountable. The pursuit of the concept of civilian security is grounded in understanding that we will only achieve sustainable peace when we resolve the underlying grievances of individuals. It also acknowledges that conflict and crisis that are present in so many countries around the world should be one of our foreign policy objectives to help prevent that conflict or to help mitigate its occurrence. So we now have a special appreciation for the many parts within the Department of State that in one way or another advance some aspect of civilian security, from the protection of human rights, as Sam mentioned, to the provision of humanitarian aid, which many of you are involved in, to combating human and drug trafficking, to improving law enforcement, to the rule of law, to initiatives that will prevent conflict, to efforts to counter violent extremism, to helping punish those who commit crimes against humanity. Each of these elements is one piece of a puzzle that helps governments create more just societies for their people. By pulling them all together within the Department of State, all told it's 5 bureaus and 3 offices under one undersecretary, we've created a mechanism for a more holistic, a more coherent approach to support the protection of individuals and ultimately the stability of nations. Simply put, we have built on the traditional state-to-state relationships and institutionalized within the Department of State a commitment to people. These changes are requiring that we internally work in a more collaborative and in a more shared way towards goals that we also share. For instance, one bureau, the Democracy and Human Rights Bureau, can work very closely with the bureau engaged in narcotics and law enforcement to make sure that the training that we're providing police officers is rooted in human rights concerns. Our counterterrorism office can work much more closely with our new Office of Youth Issues in order to address and prevent the issue of violent extremism that can result in the terrorism around the world. Now, outside of Washington, the collaboration continues in the field. In Central Asia, we have rule of law experts that are working alongside of civilian police personnel and military personnel. In Kenya, we're watching the local border officials working hand in hand with the U.S. refugee coordinators to make sure that the issues of Somalians that are fleeing their own country are addressed effectively. This realignment within the Department of State is enabling us to reorient our global engagement and to define civilian security as a key component of foreign policy. It also reinforces that civilian security ultimately depends on the degree to which governments themselves accept this responsibility, and indeed the opportunity to become more responsive, to become more accountable to their own people. So as much as all of us are wanting to create useful interventions to help people around the world, we know that a stable, well-functioning society begins and ends with good governance. And as we conceive the good governance of 21st century, we are increasingly turning to the concept of openness. to the idea that increased transparency leads to more accountability, which in turn facilitates better government practice and better provision of government services and fosters trust between citizens and elected officials. So one of the ways then to complement civilian security and to address the issue of open government is through an aptly named initiative undertaken by this administration called the Open Government Partnership, or OGP. OGP, and I want to talk about this a little bit because it involves civil society so importantly. OGP was born out of a challenge that President Obama made to countries in 2010 on the side of the United Nations General Assembly meetings. A year later, last September, he returned to New York. President Obama returned to New York, and with 7 other like-minded governments and 9 civil society organizations, launched this initiative, calling on governments to develop plans of action to provide increased transparency and to make themselves accountable for completion of these plans. 8 months later, just 2 weeks ago, since that launch happened, 55 governments have met the eligibility criteria of the Open Government Partnership and have decided to join it. And in joining it, have put forth about 250 commitments of increased transparency and accountability, which could affect the 2 billion people that live in those countries. As Secretary Clinton said a couple of weeks ago at the OGP's first annual meeting in Brasilia, which was hosted by President Dilma Rousseff, Secretary Clinton said the dividing lines of our era are not going to be between the North and the South or between the East and the West. They're going to be between open and closed. And with the stunning growth of this open government partnership, just in less than 1 year, it's very interesting to note that there is a recognition of this dividing line among countries. And we see also an appetite among governments to find their way to the right side of these questions, to the side of openness. But there's another important reason that I wanted to mention OGP today, and that's because the model of engagement that it's presenting to the world is one that from the very beginnings of the Open Government Partnership, this partnership has not just been between nations or among nations, but between government and civil society. From the oversight of this global initiative to the development and the implementation and monitoring of commitments of governments, civil society has sat side by side with governments, engaged in productive conversations and collaboration. Now, the conversation between government and civil society is not necessarily always easy, but there's been a commitment that I have witnessed myself in the shift of the conversation from an adversarial conversation that can take place to a truly collaborative one that interaction is familiar with. As one fellow in the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership told me last week, on the outside of Open Government Partnership, you are the government and I am civil society. But when we sit at this table, we are peers working together for the same thing, a better life for our fellow citizens. This Open Government Partnership is one example of how U.S. global engagement is changing, particularly as our approach to good governance is changing. Secretary Clinton has also launched a strategic dialogue with civil society, which is another platform through which we have formal exchanges with all manner of non-government organizations, civil society organizations. But I don't need to explain to Interaction members of the many different ways in which the Department of State is working with non-government organizations. I know that even just in the bureaus that I oversee, which are seeking to protect civil society, many of you are working very closely with us on these issues. For example, I know that when the Cambodian government moved forward with plans to pass a restrictive NGO law, it was really Interaction members that were among the first to take action. And in this case, we have a development-oriented NGOs that are taking the lead on a human rights issues with great success, because today that law has been suspended and it's not taking place. I know also that many of you at Interaction are working to promote the inclusion of vulnerable populations, which is very close to the work that we are doing through our bureaus, especially the Democracy and Human Rights bureaus. Populations like women, persons with disabilities, racial and ethnic and religious minorities, and LGBT people. And I want to take a moment to thank Sam in particular and the members of Interaction for all the collaboration that you've been providing in these areas. And I want to highlight also the Leadership Conference on Persons and Disabilities, which I think will be also featured in this conference. So by working with governments, with private sector, with civil society, including many of you, we're also helping in many other areas, including the International Code of Conduct for Private Security Services Providers, so that humanitarian and development organizations can continue to safely and effectively stabilize and improve conditions in high-risk environments, which is where many of you operate. I can mention many other projects that we're working on and in which we are collaborating, but there really isn't any time, and I don't want to take any more of time, and I want to let certainly our Deputy Administrator Steinberg speak to this issue. So let me just close by saying that U.S. global engagement is indeed changing as it should. We are rebalancing civilian power. We are reorganizing to better promote and achieve civilian security, and we are inviting civil society to join us, not just as implementers, but as partners in making policy. We know that we will be far more successful in achieving our shared goals if we draw solutions from all realms, from government, private companies, multilaterals, universities, nonprofits, and so on, where you bring people to the table, tapping new expertise and resources from every corner, and we think outside our own respective boxes. The perspective shifts, the challenges break down, and we in the process all change. So as the world is changing around us, we too are committed to changing with it. So on behalf of Secretary Clinton, I want to thank you all for standing with us, for the work that you do, and we are so grateful to have Interaction as a partner in these times of stability and in the times of great change that we are encountering. So thank you, and my best wishes for a very successful conference. And thank you again for all that you do.